In November 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was placed in a car and driven away from the life she knew. She was 23 years old, the daughter of the United States ambassador to Great Britain, the sister of a future president. She did not resist. She did not call out. She moved the way someone moves who has been thoroughly taught that her own movement was never really hers to decide. Anyone watching would have concluded she was being looked after. She was being erased. Her father, Joseph Kennedy, had authorized a surgical procedure on her brain 20 minutes earlier, without her consent, without telling her mother, without signing a single piece of paper that required her agreement. When the cutting stopped, Rosemary Kennedy could no longer speak in full sentences, could no longer walk without help, could no longer do most of what she had spent 23 years working, with immense and private effort, to learn. Then he hid her, in an institution in Wisconsin, and did not visit for nearly 20 years. This is the story of what Rosemary Kennedy was made to carry, and how her own father placed the weight on her, piece by piece, until carrying it was no longer possible. Nobody asked her to put it down. Nobody offered to carry any of it. She carried it alone. Old Money Tragedy shows exactly what it was. Subscribe so the weight is finally named. Before the weight arrived in full, there was a girl at the water's edge. She loved to swim. This detail appears in letters, in family accounts, in photographs taken at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. In those photographs, Rosemary Kennedy is at the shore or in the water, her face open in a way it would not always be later. Not performing, not being prepared for anything, simply there. She was born on September 13, 1918, the third child and first daughter of Joseph Patrick Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. She was born after a labor that, by accounts documented in her mother's memoir and later by her biographer Kate Clifford Larson, went badly in a way that would shape everything that followed. The attending nurse, waiting for the doctor who had been delayed, held Rosemary in the birth canal for approximately 2 hours rather than attempt a delivery without him. What that delay did to the oxygen reaching Rosemary's developing brain is not disputed. She was born with what would later be called a mild intellectual disability. She was slower to read than her siblings, slower with numbers. She required more time, more instruction, more patience. She also loved music. She danced well. She was, by the accounts of teachers and family associates from her early years, genuinely warm with people in a way that her more competitive siblings were not always. There was an ease to her in social situations, a natural affection, an openness, that the relentless Kennedy drive had not yet compressed into performance. Here is what the weight was not. In those early years, it was not the disability itself. The disability was simply how Rosemary moved through the world. What the weight was, and when it began, was the moment her family decided that how she moved through the world was a problem to be solved. The Kennedys were not a family that absorbed difficulty quietly. Joseph Kennedy had built his fortune and his name, through banking, film, real estate, and methods that were, by historical record, not always strictly legal, on a single organizing premise. What mattered was not what you were but what you appeared to be. He had grown up Irish Catholic in Boston at a time when that combination closed certain doors. His response was not to grieve the closed doors. It was to build a version of himself that no door could reasonably refuse. That version required that everything around him confirm the same story. Exceptional, polished, destined. Each of his children was an argument for that story. Proof. Rosemary was the gap in the proof. Not because she was incapable of warmth or effort or love, she had all three in abundance. But because the Kennedy version of capability was specific, academic, social, performatively brilliant. And Rosemary was measurably behind the standard. Not dramatically, not in ways that would have been immediately visible to a stranger at a dinner party, but behind enough that her father felt the gap, and more importantly, behind enough that he worried others would feel it too. So the preparation began. A series of schools, more than any of her siblings attended, because none of them could hold her long enough. Convent schools, special programs, privately hired tutors who came to the house and worked with her on the specific skills the family needed her to demonstrate in public. Rose Kennedy documented this in her own memoir With a Mother's Complicated Love. She wrote about Rosemary with genuine tenderness and also with the particular, specific anxiety of a woman in a household where falling short of the standard was not a thing that happened without consequence. What this asked of Rosemary, as a child, without the vocabulary to name what was being done, was significant. She was being trained not to be more fully herself but to perform a version of herself that fit the family's requirements. Every tutor, every drill, every practice skill carried the same unspoken message. Who you are is not sufficient. What you can be made to appear to be, that is what matters here. She did not resist this. There was no reason to resist something she had no framework to identify. She learned. She tried. She tried with the kind of sustained, effortful persistence that is, on its own terms, remarkable. In 1938, Joseph Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to the Court of St. James's, the American ambassador to Great Britain. The family moved to London. The Kennedy children were presented at the British Royal Court, before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. Rosemary was among them. She curtsied. She stood. She moved through the formal ceremony that had been drilled into her for months beforehand. The presentation occurred on May 11, 1938. There are photographs. In them, she is 20 years old and radiant, genuinely so, not artificially so. But the photographs are not the weight. The weight was everything before the photographs. The months of drilling and coaching and rehearsal so intensive that Rosemary arrived at the Court of St. James's not as herself but as a performance of herself, assembled from practice and instruction and the constant effort to hold the gap closed where it could not be naturally closed. She accepted it. She had no reason not to. She did not yet understand that accepting the first weight made the second one easier to place. Joseph Kennedy placed the weight, not as an act of cruelty that he recognized as cruelty, as an act of management that he recognized as care. This distinction is the most important thing to understand about how the loading worked. He was not indifferent to Rosemary. By the evidence of his letters and his documented behavior, he was actively engaged with her situation. More engaged, in certain ways, than he was with his other children's daily circumstances. He arranged her schools. He consulted specialists. He wrote letters expressing concern for her progress and her well-being. He was present in the way that a man who views a problem as his responsibility to solve is present. Focused, purposeful, and entirely convinced of the legitimacy of his own framework. The framework was the weight. The framework said, there is a standard. The standard is what Kennedys are. You are a Kennedy. Therefore you must meet the standard. Whatever distance exists between you and the standard is the problem, and the problem is yours to carry until it is solved. He had grown up competing against exclusion, against poverty in the generation before his own, against a Protestant establishment that did not want his kind at its tables. He had competed his way rough every door. He had built a fortune from roughly nothing and turned it into a political dynasty. The method was always the same. Identify the gap, close the gap, do not acknowledge the gap publicly while closing it. Rosemary's gap could not be fully closed. The tutors could not close it. The convent schools could not close it. The drilling and the coaching and the rehearsal could narrow it, could make it invisible enough in specific, controlled social situations, but they could not eliminate it. He called the ongoing effort protection. He told Rosemary's teachers, told the various doctors he consulted over 2 decades, that he was protecting Rosemary from a world that would not understand her. He was protecting the family from scrutiny. He was protecting the future. He called it responsibility. She carried it as responsibility. They were not talking about the same thing. What he gained while she carried it. Freedom from the question. As long as Rosemary was being successfully managed, present in the photographs, functional at family events, performing adequately in the social spaces the family occupied, her existence required no renegotiation of the Kennedy story. She was not a secret. She was not absent. She was there, and her being there made the story hold together. But she was holding it together. Not him. She was the one in the rooms being watched, deploying the skills that had been installed in her through years of instruction, holding the performance intact while he stood elsewhere receiving the benefit of it. This is what the loading looked like from the outside. A wealthy, attentive father investing extraordinary resources in a daughter with special needs. what it looked like from where she was standing, the inescapable message that who she actually was could not be permitted to show. After London, the family returned to the United States, and the question of Rosemary's adult life became impossible to defer. Her siblings were moving forward. Joe Jr. was being positioned for a political career that his father had been engineering for years. Jack Kennedy was being pulled toward the same trajectory. Kathleen was moving in society. Pat and Jean were younger, but their paths were clearly framed. Rosemary was 22, then 23. The convent school in Washington, St. Gertrude's, was where she had landed. It was not a plan for her future. It was a pause before one. The nuns at St. Gertrude's began reporting in 1940 and into 1941 that Rosemary was experiencing episodes of mood disturbance, agitation, periodic combativeness, what the language of the era would have called behavioral difficulties. She was, according to some accounts, leaving the convent at night, returning late. The sisters who documented these episodes described a woman who was not out of control so much as she was in motion, restless in a way that suggested she was looking for something outside the boundaries that had been drawn around her, though she would not have had the words to say what it was. Joseph Kennedy received these reports. What he read in them was deterioration, a problem expanding past the point of management. His youngest daughter Teddy would later say that their father never spoke of Rosemary without a kind of controlled urgency, as though the situation were a business problem that had run past its deadline. What he did not read in them, what he had not been built to read, was a 23-year-old woman communicating the only way still available to her that something in her life had become unbearable. Not deteriorating, responding. There is a difference between those two things that mattered enormously to Rosemary Kennedy and that Joseph Kennedy appears never to have considered. He called a doctor instead. The weight had a specific architecture. It did not arrive all at once. It was added to layer by layer, in a sequence that only becomes visible when you stand back far enough to see all of it. The first weight was the standard itself, the Kennedy measure of what a person was supposed to be. This weight was placed on Rosemary in childhood, before she had language for it, and it shaped every subsequent experience. It was not a single event. It was the cumulative reality of growing up in a household where who she naturally was consistently fell short of what was required. It sat in her posture. It sat in the careful monitoring of her own behavior that the family's expectations demanded she maintain at all times. Carrying a standard you cannot fully meet every day of your childhood is not a small weight. It rearranges how you understand yourself. It makes your own experience legible only in terms of the gap, not in terms of what you actually are, but in terms of the distance between that and what you are supposed to be. She carried it anyway. The second weight was placed in London in 1938, and it was different in kind from the first. In London, the standard stopped being a private family matter and became public infrastructure. The ambassador's family lived in the public eye. The court presentation was covered by the press. Every event, every dinner, every appearance was documented, photographed, reported on. Rosemary was not being asked to meet the Kennedy standard in the relative privacy of the family household. She was being asked to meet it in front of the British court, the American press, and the full apparatus of diplomatic society. This required something the first weight had not required: sustained public performance under conditions where the margin for visible error was genuinely zero. The second weight changed how she moved through a room. Nobody mentioned it. People who knew her before the London years described someone relaxed in social situations, genuinely comfortable, warm, easy with strangers. After London, that quality had shifted. She became watchful. There was an effortfulness to her public presence that had not been there before. A Cybele monitoring of her own behavior that the people around her either did not notice or chose not to name. The warmth was still there, but it was now located inside a framework of active self-surveillance that had not previously been part of how she occupied space. The third weight arrived when the family returned to America, and it was the heaviest of the three, not because of what it asked her to do, but because of what it showed her. It showed her there was no path forward. Her siblings were building futures, not abstractly, concretely. Joe Jr. was on a trajectory her father had been engineering for over a decade. Jack was moving toward Congress. Kathleen had her social world, her connections, her own horizon that extended past the current year. Even the younger Kennedy children had futures being shaped and planned for, futures that were discussed openly in the family as real destinations. Rosemary had a convent school in Washington where nuns reported her behavior to her father. She was 23 years old. And the third weight, the weight of a future that had simply not been imagined for her, a horizon that had been allowed to close, landed on top of the other two with the particular crushing quality of finality. She was not going to be relieved of any of this. It was not building towards something. Simply was. And it was going to continue to simply be indefinitely, without her having any voice in what form it took or what happened next. The agitation the nuns reported was not a symptom. It was a response. The moment she understood that she was not going to be released from any of it, that understanding is visible in what happened in Washington in 1940 and 1941, in the nights she left the convent, in the episodes the nuns documented and her father received as evidence that she was deteriorating. She was not deteriorating. She was 23 years old and she was finally showing on the outside what carrying 3 weights for 23 years actually costs. The first weight, when you open it and examine what is actually inside, contains a belief about her value. From the outside, what anyone observed for the first 20 years of Rosemary Kennedy's life looked like investment. Schools paid for, tutors hired, time spent, effort made. The family did not abandon her. They did not institutionalize her as a child, as many families of that era did with children who had intellectual disabilities. They kept her, prepared her, brought her to London, stood her before the British royal court. What was inside all of that investment was a message that ran through every piece of it. You are acceptable only as a performance of yourself, not as yourself. The investment was conditional. The inclusion was contingent. Every resource deployed on her behalf was deployed in service of closing the gap, not in service of the person the gap was being asked to define. What carrying this specific content did to Rosemary, it made her self-understanding entirely gap-shaped. She did not have access to a version of herself that was simply sufficient. Her letters, several of which survive in archives and have been described by biographer Kate Clifford Larson, reveal a woman who had fully absorbed the framework. She wrote about wanting to do better, about trying harder, about making her father proud. These are not the letters of someone who understood herself as already enough. These are the letters of someone who had been given the gap as her primary identity and was working to close it. Someone had packed this weight carefully. What was inside it was not accidental. The second weight, when opened, contains something that takes longer to recognize: political capital. By 1938, Joseph Kennedy's ambitions for his sons, and through his sons for himself, were no longer background planning. They were the central project of his life. Jack Kennedy's path to Congress was being laid. The family's public image was not a personal matter. T was infrastructure for a political operation that would eventually produce a president of the United States. Rosemary's visibility inside that family, her presence at events, her inclusion in the public photographs, her appearance alongside her siblings at the things that mattered, was not primarily about her. It was about what her absence would have required explaining. A Kennedy daughter missing from the family portrait, unaccounted for, generates questions. Questions generate scrutiny. Scrutiny was the thing her father's entire operation was built to prevent. She was being used as evidence. The evidence that the Kennedys were whole, complete, unblemished. She was a living argument against the story that anything was wrong. She was carrying that argument in every public room she entered. What the combination of the first and second weights produced, what neither produced alone, was a specific contradiction she was required to hold simultaneously. She was privately insufficient and publicly necessary. She was being told through every structure of her life that who she was needed to be corrected, and at the same time she was being deployed publicly as proof that nothing needed correcting. Carrying both at once requires a kind of sustained internal splitting that has a cost. The cost is not metaphorical. It shows up in the body. It showed up, eventually, in Washington in the episodes the nuns described. In the nights she left the convent. In the person the reports were painting for her father, who read deterioration where the picture was actually showing him the cost of what he had been asking her to hold. The third weight, when opened, holds the most specific contents of all. It holds the surgery that had not yet happened. What the third weight contained, the closed horizon, the absent future, the life administered as a management problem with no exit, was the conditions that made the surgery possible. Because Joseph Kennedy could not have walked a lob. Otomy passed a daughter who had her own clear sense of her life and where it was going. He could not have walked it past a daughter who had advocates, relationships, social ties that existed outside the family's management of her. He could not have walked it past a woman who understood herself as a person with rights. The 23 years of wait, the standard, the performance, the contingent inclusion, the absent future, had built a world in which Rosemary had no standing from which to say no. She had never been given standing. The wait had been specifically designed, piece by piece, to ensure that when the final decision came, it would not require her agreement. This was not random. The three weights together were a system. First, make her understand she is the problem. Second, make her public presence conditional on managing the problem invisibly. Third, remove her future as an independent concept so that her father's decisions about her life encounter no competing framework. She had been carrying all of it, for longer than anyone had noticed, and inside each weight, someone had placed exactly what they needed her to hold so they would not have to. The weight she placed on herself on top of everything else. The weight of hope. She kept trying. Year after year, through schools and tutors and formal dinners in London and Washington, she kept trying to close the gap through effort. She wrote in her letters about wanting to do better. She practiced. She worked. She believed, because she had been given no other framework, that if she was effortful enough, compliant enough, good enough, the weight would eventually become something else. That she would eventually arrive at a place where she was enough. This is the heaviest thing she carried and the one nobody placed there deliberately. She placed it herself, from love and from the total absence of any alternative story about who she could be. It did not save her. Kept her trying right up until November 19th. 41. She had been carrying all of it, for longer than anyone had noticed. And inside each weight, someone had placed exactly what they needed her to hold so they would not have to. What changed first was her handwriting. Rosemary Kennedy's letters from her early adolescence, preserved in family archives and described in detail by Kate Clifford Larson, show a labored but alive hand. She wrote slowly and with effort. The formations are careful, the corrections visible, the persistence evident in every line. What those early letters communicate, independent of their content, is someone who is working hard at the act of self-expression, straining toward it, reaching. Her letters from the London years and the Washington years are different in a way that is harder to name but unmistakable once you see it. The physical quality of the writing has not degraded. What has changed is the quality of the reaching. The early letters have the feel of someone pressing against the boundaries of what she can do, trying to extend them. The later letters have the feel of someone writing within a known, fixed boundary carefully so as not to approach the edge. She had stopped reaching. She had always reached. Nobody connected the two things. What changed next was her relationship to belonging. Before London, in the Hyannisport years, in the earlier school years, the family photographs and accounts from people who moved in Kennedy social circles show Rosemary as genuinely integrated into the family's life. Not accommodated. Not managed. Present in the way the other children were present. Noisy, participatory. Included in the rough and tumble of a large, loud, competitive family that was also, genuinely, a family. After London, the integration had changed in a way that is visible in the record. She was still in the photographs. She was still at the events. But she was being handled, there is no cleaner word, in a way that placed a layer of active management between her and the Natu. Real belonging she had had before. The preparation before events. The watchfulness during them. The debrief afterward. The assessment of how she had performed. Once you have been made to understand that your presence in your own family requires a passing grade, belonging becomes conditional. You are no longer home. You are being evaluated in a space that looks like home. What this closed off permanently. The ease. The quality of moving through a family room without monitoring your own performance. That quality, the unself-consciousness of someone who simply belongs where they are, was gone by the Washington years. What had replaced it was the effortful vigilance of someone who understood, at whatever level of understanding was available to her, that her continued presence was contingent on something she had to keep producing. What changed last, and what any person meeting Rosemary Kennedy for the first time in Washington in 1941 would have seen without having any of the context, was the exhaustion. She had been carrying 3 weights for 23 years. The effort required to carry them had been metabolizing her from the inside, the way sustained effort always does when it is never relieved and never acknowledged. The agitation the nuns reported was not a new condition. It was the final expression of something that had been accumulating across decades of asking a person to be something she could not naturally be, indefinitely, without rest, in service of a story that was not about her. She was tired. That is what the reports were documenting. She was 23 years old and she was showing, now on the outside, that she was tired. What the weight could not change, through all of it, through London and Washington and the schools and the nuns and the nights she walked out and the reports her father read as evidence against her, was this: she was warm. It survived everything. The nuns at St. Coletta's in Wisconsin, where she would live for most of the rest of her life, documented it across the decades. She was affectionate with people she trusted. She responded to kindness with her whole self. She retained her love of water throughout her life. She swam at St. Coletta's, in the pool they eventually built for her, well into her older years. The thing in her that had been open at the water's edge in Hyannisport, that fundamental quality of warmth and response, was still there. The surgery would take her language. It would take her coordination, her capacity for independent living, most of her cognitive function. It would not take that. One thing the weight could not change. That is the most important thing in this story. On November 13, 1941, Rosemary Kennedy was taken to George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. The surgeon was Dr. Walter Freeman, who had become, by the early 1940s, the most prominent American advocate for a procedure called the prefrontal lobotomy, a surgical intervention that severed the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. Freeman had performed and promoted the procedure widely, arguing it could resolve behavioral and psychiatric disturbances in patients who had not responded to other treatment. He operated with Dr. James Watts. The procedure was performed while Rosemary Kennedy was awake. This is documented in Dr. Watts's own account, given in a published interview years later. Freeman asked her to sing songs, to recite prayers, to count backward. He continued cutting into her brain while she responded. He continued until she became incoherent. When her responses stopped making sense, when the words stopped forming coherently, he stopped cutting. The procedure lasted approximately 20 minutes. When it was over, Rosemary Kennedy could not speak in full sentences. She could not walk without assistance. She had lost most of the function she had spent 23 years, with extraordinary effort, learning to perform. The mild intellectual disability that her father had spent 2 decades managing, coaching, concealing, drilling into acceptability, was replaced with severe cognitive and physical impairment from which she would never recover. Joseph Kennedy had authorized the procedure without telling Rose Kennedy, without consulting Rosemary's teachers, the nuns at St. Gertrude's, or any of the family's other advisors, without obtaining Rosemary's own agreement. Rose Kennedy documented in her memoir that she did not learn what had been done to her daughter until after it was done. The first she knew of it was the outcome. This is the weight from the cold open, now fully visible. She was 23 years old. She had spent those 23 years learning, with enormous private effort, that the gap between herself and the Kennedy standard was her problem to solve. She had written letters about wanting to do better. She had curtsied before the King and Queen of England. She had sat at diplomatic dinners and smiled at formal events and walked through rooms where she was being watched and assessed, deploying everything that had been installed in her through years of instruction, holding the performance intact. And when the performance finally began to cost more than she had left to pay, when the exhaustion became visible, when the effort started showing, when the agitation that was simply the weight becoming too heavy was reported to her father as evidence of deterioration, his response was to authorize a surgeon to enter her brain and cut until she went quiet. He placed her at St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, after the surgery. According to records and family accounts, he did not visit her there for approximately 20 years. Records suggest he did not see her in person again until the early 1960s. Rose Kennedy did not know for some time which institution her daughter had been placed in. Nobody explained to the public what had happened. The family's official account, when Rosemary was acknowledged at all, was that she had been living quietly due to her intellectual disability. The lobotomy was not publicly disclosed during Joseph Kennedy's lifetime. The world that had watched Rosemary Kennedy curtsy before the British court, that had seen her in the family photographs, that had read her father described as a devoted patriarch, that world did not know what he had done. She had been carrying the weight of being her family's problem for 23 years. The surgery was the solution he had been building toward, whether he knew it or not, from the moment he first described his daughter as a liability. The weight was gone. So was most of Rosemary Kennedy. Nobody asked what was inside it. What the weight left in the record is specific, documented, and impossible to misread once you have seen it clearly. The letters Rosemary Kennedy wrote before the surgery survive in archives and have been examined in detail by historians, most extensively by Kate Clifford Larson in her 2015 biography Rosemary, The Hidden Kennedy Daughter. They are the letters of a woman working hard at self-expression. Labored, warm, straining toward connection. They are also the letters of a woman who has been given the gap as her primary identity and is addressing her father from inside that frame. She wanted to do better. She wanted to make him proud. These letters are evidence, not of insufficiency, but of what she was made to understand about herself. The photographs survive. The court presentation photographs, the family photographs, the Hyannisport photographs from before the weight arrived in full. Anyone who looks at those photographs and then at the documented outcome of November 1941 is holding, in their hands, the distance between what she was and what was done to her. The consent documentation does not exist, because her consent was never sought. There is no record of Rosemary Kennedy agreeing to the surgery. What exists in its place is a set of accounts. Dr. Watts's published interview, in which he described the procedure in clinical detail. Rose Kennedy's memoir, in which she documented her own exclusion from the decision. Joseph Kennedy's communications with Dr. Freeman, portions of which have been described in historical accounts. Nobody named what was happening to her while it was happening. Nobody in the Kennedy family, in the institutions that managed her, in the medical apparatus her father engaged. Nobody looked at the full weight of what was being placed on this woman and called it what it was. I have read accounts of women carrying this kind of weight before. What is different here, what stayed with me, is how specifically it was placed. This was not a family in chaos making imperfect decisions under pressure. This was a patriarch, methodically over decades, constructing the conditions under which his daughter could be acted on without her agreement. The weight was the preparation for the surgery. The surgery was the logical conclusion of the weight. What the weight left in the people who watched her carry it. Eunice Kennedy Shriver carried the witness of it for the rest of her life. She had been closest to Rosemary among the siblings. She had watched her sister be managed and prepared and drilled and then, suddenly, gone. Removed to Wisconsin without adequate explanation, visited rarely, spoken about in the family only in the most careful terms. Eunice knew. Not all of it, not at first. But enough to understand that Rosemary had been taken from the family not by illness but by a decision her father had made alone and without asking anyone who loved her. In 1962, Eunice wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post discussing Rosemary publicly, the first time a Kennedy family member had acknowledged her disability openly in print. It was a quietly radical act inside a family whose operating principle had always been silence. In 1968, she founded the Special Olympics. The founding document. Aishan and Eunice's own written accounts make the motivation explicit. What happened to Rosemary? What Eunice had watched happen to her sister became the founding impulse of one of the largest organizations in the world dedicated to the dignity and capability of people with intellectual disabilities. The Special Olympics today includes more than 6 million athletes across 190 countries. That is documented. That is real. And it does not make what was done to Rosemary acceptable. It makes it larger. The weight her father placed on his daughter, and then solved by destroying her, produced something through her sister that Joseph Kennedy almost certainly never anticipated. The women in that family, it turns out, were carrying things he had never bothered to account for. What the weight left in Rosemary herself. She lived at St. Coletta's in Jefferson, Wisconsin, for most of the rest of her life. She outlived her father, Joseph Kennedy, who died in 1969. She outlived the presidency of her brother Jack, assassinated in 1963. She outlived the assassination of her brother Bobby in 1968. She outlived the long public unraveling of the family's mythology and the slow historical accounting of what Joseph Kennedy had actually been. She swam. The sisters at St. Coletta's built her a pool, and she used it. She walked the grounds. She was known, by the women who cared for her across the decades, as affectionate and warm, the same quality that had been documented in the Hyannisport years, the same quality that no weight and no surgery had managed to extinguish. She died on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. She was the longest-lived of the Kennedy children of her generation. Rosemary Kennedy should never have been asked to carry the weight of her father's definition of the family name. Not her disability, that was simply her. Not the gap between herself and a standard she had no part in creating. Not the decades of performance that asked her to be a different version of herself in every public room she entered. Not the political capital her presence was used to produce. Not the conditions her father spent 23 years carefully building that ended with a surgeon cutting into her brain while she counted backward and sang. That weight, the Kennedy name as Joseph Kennedy defined it, which had no room for her as she actually was, that was the one she